David, that will be the last call we take. Again, the House of Representatives, also the Senate meeting today to discuss issues. But as for right now, we take you to the House.
The House will be in order. Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 12, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Jason Chaffetz to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. We thank you for your ongoing presence and sustaining grace in us all and your concern for our nation. Continue to bless and inspire the members of the People's House. May they be encouraged in the movement that has occurred, and may the hopes and prayers of the American people, and indeed the world, that a break in our current impasse may be imminent, be fulfilled. Forgive our failures. Forgive our lack of faith. May the good intentions of all acting in this House be rewarded by solutions to our struggles that benefit our nation. May all that is done be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
Amen. The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces that to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur.
I ask all present to join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will now entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the mall and the memorials on the mall are public places open 24 hours a day. But the Park Service has closed them using the excuse of the shutdown. But the Park Service discriminates who may exercise the First Amendment and who may not. It allowed a free speech immigration rally on the mall, but denied people access to the World War II memorial. This is arbitrary, thus constitutionally unlawful. The Park Service forgets also that the First Amendment includes the right of the people to peaceably assemble. The Supreme Court sometimes limits the First Amendment, citing a compelling state interest, even though the First Amendment doesn't really give that exception. The government's compelling state interest here? Lack of money. Does this mean any time the government claims it has no funds, it can shut down the First Amendment, deny the right to peaceably assemble? I think not. This excuse is ludicrous, unlawful, arbitrary, and in practice it discriminates. The First Amendment was written to prevent this very type of action by government. Let the people assemble, take the barricades of constitutional oppression down. And that's just the way it is.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to call on House Republicans to end the federal government shutdown. The shutdown is causing significant negative impacts on our economy, jobs, and consumer confidence across our country. The number of people applying for unemployment benefits jumped by 66,000 this week. Local economies across our nation are losing $76 million a day from people not able to visit our nation's parks. Just in one location, the closing of Zion National Park in Utah has cost the surrounding community over $3.5 million in lost visitor spending. The Head Start program already has turned away over 7,000 children across this country, and U.S. consumer confidence has deteriorated in October to its weakest in 9 months. since the first federal shutdown over 17 years ago. The federal shutdown is stalling almost 130 highway and bridge projects in 35 states,
Gentlewoman's
which
time
means
has expired.
lost jobs. Mr. Speaker, let's end this uncertainty for our nation.
Gentlewoman's time has
Let's stop the
expired.
battering of jobs in this economy, bring a clean, continuing
Gentlewoman's
resolution
time
to
has
the floor,
expired.
and reopen the government of the
Gentlewoman's
United
time has
States.
expired. We could ask all members to refrain from conversations on the floor as we conduct these 1 minutes. What purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker, but the House is not in order, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman is correct. If the House will maintain order, we'd ask members to refrain from conversations on the floor. Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is time for solutions to end the government shutdown and resolve the uncertainty of America's rapidly approaching credit limit. Every day, House Republicans are working to shape a bipartisan agreement to reopen the federal government and restore services for the American people. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentlewoman is correct.
A point of parliamentary information. The members are trying to open the government.
Gentleman is not recognized. The House will be in order. Gentlewoman may proceed.
While the Senate has refused to talk, House Republicans have worked to find bipartisan common ground and pass legislation to restore services that should be open and running for North Carolinians, for all Americans. Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives passed 15 separate measures to pay our military, restore the WIC program, open national parks, and end delays to veteran benefit applications, among other things. Like my constituents, I think the gridlock in Washington needs to stop. To have any hope of solving the challenges before us, be it this shutdown or a debt crisis, Democrats can't simply refuse to negotiate. They have to be willing to work together. Divided government demands bipartisan solutions. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Speaker, I rise to ask unanimous consent to address the House floor for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Day number 12. Mr. Speaker, today is the 12th day of a government shutdown, and 1 day closer to defaulting on our debt. Mr. Speaker, in the history of our great nation, we've never not paid our bills. We're Americans. We always pay our bills. Mr. Speaker, enough with the gamesmanship, the finger-pointing, the name-calling. It's time to get back to business. Mr. Speaker, we can do it in 3 easy steps. Step 1, let's open the government. Step 2, let's pay our bills. And step 3, let's negotiate a real budget that begins to rebuild jobs and an economy that rebuilds middle-class America. Mr. Speaker, everyone wins, especially the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In New Hampshire and across our country, we continue to see that the leadership in this House has led to congressional dysfunction that is damaging our lives and damaging our economy. Every day I have been speaking with mayors, business owners, and constituents in my district to hear how Washington's inability to do its job is hurting their ability to do their job. This week I held a telephone town hall and heard from Granite Staters who don't understand why the leadership in this Congress can't simply fix this problem that's hurting our state and our economy. Our banks are diverting time and effort planning for a potential default instead of focusing on serving families and businesses in New Hampshire. The Small Business Administration has frozen general loans to small businesses. The shutdown is threatening funding that keeps families in their homes and infuses millions of dollars into our economy. Every day this shutdown continues is a day that Congress does not focus on the economy and the middle class. Mr. Speaker, let us vote to open the government.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason dozens of my colleagues are here is to reopen government. Too often during this shutdown, the discussion of this shutdown is what's lost is the real hardship that's faced by the people we represent. I heard from a woman this week who told me that she was attempting to find a job and move her family out of a shelter. She put in the work to make the necessary appointments. She filled out the paperwork for a housing voucher, set up a job interview, and was given an opportunity. Let's talk about how this shutdown affected her. She can't be brought onto the job. No one can, because the job relies on a government contract that's on hold in this shutdown. She can't move into permanent and safe housing because her housing voucher can't be processed during this government shutdown. There are others. I spoke with the leaders of the Emergency Food Network in Tacoma, who said that as this shutdown continues and as funding for women, infant, and children nutrition programs deteriorates, they're struggling to even provide baby formula.
Gentleman's time has expired.
We need to reopen this government.
Gentleman's time has expired.
It's harming our economy, and it's straining the social fabric of our country.
Gentleman's time has expired. This is the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition.
To address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am looking forward to joining my colleagues in that line to sign a discharge petition that will reopen government. Not with conditions, not on the condition that we want this thing or we want that thing and we won't over the government until we get it, but just to open the government with no conditions. My Republican friends know very well that this shutdown is for one reason and one reason only. It is because they wanted to delay, defund, destroy health care for the American people, and they're ready to destroy the American economy unless they get it. We don't have to go through this long line. We can open up the government in 15 minutes if Speaker Boehner puts a clean continuing resolution on the floor right now. Let's get it done.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Idaho seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 371, I call up Joint Resolution H.J. 80, a joint resolution making continuing appropriations for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, the Indian Health Services, and for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes, and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 80, joint resolution making continuing appropriations for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, and the Indian Health Service for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 371, the joint resolution is considered read. The joint resolution shall be debatable for 40 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, and the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Lowy, will each control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.J. Res. 80, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself.
The gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order. And ask first that members clear the well. Does the gentleman from Idaho yield to the gentlewoman for a parliamentary inquiry?
I yield for a parliamentary inquiry.
Speaker,
gentlewoman's recognized.
I thank the Speaker. Is it in order to put the clean bill on the floor from the Senate to open the government?
The gentlewoman has not stated a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Is it appropriate?
Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
I thank the
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this important legislation to continue funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Education and the Indian Health Services. This bill focuses on education, law enforcement, health care, and many other vital services to American Indians and Alaska Natives. Mr. Speaker, long ago, the federal government made treaty commitments to American Indians, who in return ceded the vast lands that make up the United States today. Visit just any Indian reservation today and you will quickly realize that the federal government hasn't even come close to living up to its end of the bargain. My colleagues on the subcommittee on both sides of the aisle and my predecessors before me, Mr. Moran and Mr. Dix that chaired this committee, have been working hard over the past several years to address the critical needs and challenges in Indian country. Even in declining budget environments, on a bipartisan basis, our committee continues to make funding for Indian country a priority. That is why I doubt my friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle will oppose the merits of this bill. They might oppose the strategy of getting here, but they probably won't oppose the merits of the bill as something that we agree on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Speaker, for the past 11 days, the House has been attempting to reopen parts of the government without further delay and without trying to extract any further concessions from the Senate or the President. Mr. Speaker, you can't go wrong by trying to do the right thing. Right here, right now, those of us who care about Indian country have been given an opportunity to do the right thing. Let's not waste this opportunity pointing fingers and arguing over everything other than the topic at hand. The topic at hand is Indian health, Indian education, and the BIA. This is the hand we've been dealt. Let's do the right thing. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent that I be able to control the time, or does Ms. Lowy, I guess there's a parliamentary procedure, does Ms. Lowy have to request that, or can I request that?
The gentleman is recognized.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I will yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we go again. Each day, the gaping wound that the government shutdown represents grows bigger, and the House Republican response continues to be these little Band-Aids. Of course, we on the Democratic side want to see all Native American programs funded. The other side knows that. And in fact, this has been one area where we have achieved bipartisan agreement. Both Chairman Simpson, and I want to particularly mention Mr. Cole on our subcommittee, myself, Ms. McCollum, all of us have tried to put as much money as possible, given very severe fiscal constraints, into Native American programs. But this bill that's on the floor today, in fact, doesn't serve its stated purpose. We're going to hear from House Republicans what this latest Band-Aid temporarily funds. But here are just some of the Native American programs and offices that are not funded by this resolution. Native American education programs that are funded by the Department of Education. Native American law enforcement programs funded by the Department of Justice, including the programs to carry out the Violence Against Women Act. That's an area where we had achieved, finally, bipartisan agreement. This doesn't allow us the funds to carry out that program. Native American social service programs that are funded by the Department.
Gentlewoman is correct. Members will please take their conversations from the floor and clear the well. Gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I understand that this is a very trying day for all of the American people and that our colleagues feel that as well. So I'm happy to speak through the interruption. But I do want to make the point, these Native American social service programs that are so important to the American Indians, particularly on our reservations, are not funded by this bill. includes the child care and temporary assistance to needy families, because they're funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. Native American housing programs funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD has the highest percentage, almost 100% of its employees that are furloughed. Still, what is this, the 11th day, Mr. Speaker? That was a rhetorical question. Mr. Speaker, while this resolution temporarily funds the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education, it fails to fund the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, which oversees those agencies. So we're not even willing to fund the office that's responsible for managing the programs that we purport to fund today. And what about the Office of the Special Trustee, which administers $3.7 billion in tribal funds and $728 million in individual Indian accounts? That's not funded either. So let's not be deluded that this is going to fix the situation with regard to our Native Americans. And that's why a number of tribes have opposed this way of doing it. They want all the government to open up, because it is their government as well. Mr. Speaker, the underlying basis for the Republican shutdown of the government has been an irrational and intransigent opposition to the Affordable Care Act. That's how it started. House Republicans voted 43 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And at the same time, they were voting to repeal the permanent reauthorization of the Indian Health Care Improvement Act. Every time the other side voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they were voting to repeal the permanent reauthorization of the Indian Health Care Act, as well as voting to repeal many new programs that are contained in the Affordable Care Act that are designed to assist the Indian Health Service in meeting its mission to raise the health status of Native Americans. These 43 attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act and the shutting down of government is all the more disheartening because we in the Subcommittee on Interior and Environment have so strongly supported Native American programs. Now, unlike what we have seen in the last week as certain members have marched the floor to claim support for the NIH and Head Start, all of which we strongly support, even as members have pushed sequester and proposed additional cuts to these programs in 2014 on the other side, this subcommittee has the bipartisan commitment to Native American programs. That's something we should be proud of. And this subcommittee, I know, does not want to go about funding Native American programs in this manner. It's a half-hearted, Band-Aid approach. It's wrong. We need to fund all Native American programs. We need to fund all of the federal government. It's long past time for this shutdown to end. So let's release all the federal employees that have been taken hostage. Let's reopen the people's government. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Idaho.
Mr. Speaker, it is now my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Hastings.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in full support of this resolution to fund the Bureau of Indian Affairs. While House Republicans continue to offer solutions to end this government shutdown, we will continue also to take steps to provide funding for important areas of our government. This measure fulfills the Congress's unique responsibility to fund programs vital to Indian tribes and Alaska Natives. There are 56 million acres of Indian trust lands in the United States. Unlike other privately owned lands, in most cases, Indian trust lands may not be leased for development purposes without the approval of the Secretary of Interior. These lands are critical for Indian tribes to create jobs and generate revenue for their reservation economies. For example, in my Central Washington district, 2 tribes are major producers of timber that employ hundreds of people and produce income for tribal governments and thousands of individual members. In other parts of the country, tribes utilize their trust lands for oil, natural gas, and coal development, and for a variety of business leasing and housing. It is critical to ensure continued funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to perform functions necessary for tribes and individual landowners to lease and develop their lands. The joint resolution additionally provides funding for the Indian Health Service programs. While direct care for acute and chronic health conditions is being provided as an essential government service to Native Americans during the shutdown, other services, such as preventive care, have been scaled back. It is critical that these be restored to normal operations. The President repeatedly stresses the importance of the United States' unique relations with Indian tribes. He now has an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to match his rhetoric with action by supporting the passage of this resolution and signing it into law. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Idaho reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, it's my great pleasure right now to yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the full Appropriations Committee, Ms. Anita Lowy from New York.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the Republican shutdown. Of course we support funding for Indian education and health services. Unfortunately, the House hasn't had the opportunity to approve funding for these programs this year because the majority did not have the courage of their convictions to bring their FY14 Interior and Environment or the Labor HHS appropriations bills to the House floor. Don't for a moment think that today's bill fulfills their commitments to Native Americans. Under this bill, they will still not receive funding they are due from the Departments of Justice and the Departments of Education. This is nothing more than a Republican ploy, and the claim that Democrats are not negotiating is absolutely false. House Republicans wrote a bill, sent it to the Senate. The Senate adopted the most important part of it, the funding level. And the President agreed to sign it, even though Democrats wanted greater investments to support economic growth, jobs. The only thing Democrats oppose are irresponsible efforts to put health care decisions back in the hands of insurance companies, which has nothing to do with keeping the government open. That is democracy. That is negotiation. We have done more than meet in the middle, but the Republicans now say no to their own bill. We could end the shutdown today if the majority would only support a reasonable solution to allow a vote on the Republican-written Senate-passed bill. Vote no, demand a House vote to immediately end the reckless Republican shutdown. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Idaho.
It is now my pleasure to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Daines.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 minute 30 seconds.
I rise in support today of this resolution to appropriate funds for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Health Service, and the Bureau of Indian Education today because our Native Americans cannot sustain another day of this Washington gridlock. In my home state of Montana, we have 7 Indian reservations and also the state-recognized Little Shell Tribe. We're working right now to get federal recognition for the Little Shell Tribe. Native Americans encompass 6% of Montana's population. But on our reservations, unemployment can rise as high as 50%. The Indian Health Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and education can literally be lifelines for many. Earlier this year, when I visited the Salish and Kootenai College, I learned about their slogan, grounded in tradition, charging into the future. Our reservations want to be self-sustaining, but without adequate health services, education, and economic opportunities, that goal is unattainable. I want our Native children to be able to thrive in my home state of Montana. That's why I support this resolution today. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Idaho reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to inquire how much time we have on both sides remaining in the debate.
Gentleman from Virginia has 12.5 minutes, and the gentleman from Idaho has 14.5 minutes.
At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes from the gentlelady from Minnesota, the chair of the Indian Caucus, Ms. Betty McCollum.
Mr. Speaker?
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentlewoman is correct. If members would please refrain from conversations on the floor. Gentlewoman may proceed.
Thank you, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose this bill. As a Democratic co-chair of the Native American Caucus, I'm here to promote respect for tribal sovereignty, to fight for the needs of Native American families, and to call our federal government to uphold its trust and treaty obligations. Mr. Cole, my Republican co-chair, Ranking Member Moran, and Mr. Simpson, the author of this legislation, share those very same goals. But I strongly believe that the bill before us today does not meet the needs of Indian country. A broader solution is needed. The National Conference of American Indians has asked us to, quote, reopen government operations for all federal agencies that meet trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations and to stop the sequester of 2014. And I've heard that same message loud and clear from Minnesota tribal leaders. Mr. Speaker, when we consider federal funding for tribal nations, we are talking about government-to-government relationships. This means the entire federal government needs to be open and functioning. Many services have been pointed out that are vital to Indian country are not funded with BIA or IHS. The Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Education, Justice, Transportation, and other agencies within HHS or Interior all have Native American accounts. Food distribution on Indian reservations is administered by the Department of Agriculture, and no funds are able to replenish food reserves that support 76,000 low-income Native American Indians each month. In Minnesota, winter is on its way, and tribal housing development has been brought to a halt for White Earth Nation because of the Bureau of Land Management is closed. Mr. Speaker, I could list dozens of other important tribal partnerships and contracts that this bill will not reopen, and I have one example I'm going to enter for the record from the Oglala Sioux and the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, with your permission.
Without objection, sir.
To support tribal nations, we need to bring an end to this shutdown and vote on a clean funding bill for the entire government.
Expired.
I will vote no on this bill. I encourage others.
Yields back. Gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Idaho.
Mr. Speaker, it is now my pleasure to yield to the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Alaska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Unanimous consent to rise and extend.
Without objection, sir.
My fellow colleagues, this is an important piece of legislation. When you vote against this legislation, you're voting against the first Americans. Everyone in this room is an immigrant. But we made a trust relationship with American Indians to take care of them, provide them, and a trust relationship we should fulfill. You say this won't go anywhere. Very frankly, we should have done this a long time ago. We should set up a system, because of the trust system, that they are front-end loaded for their health care primarily. We have a system now that does not work. They have to hold their hand out and beg. And a lot of you on that side, all you'll say, don't say too much. Take your blanket and your half a beef and go home and be quiet. No other minority would be treated that way. This health system has to be fixed. We have an opportunity to fix it now. We should fix it now. When people stand up and say, I support the American Indians, the first Americans, you're not really supporting, you're paying lip service. You're paying lip service. That's all you have been doing for all these years ever since Columbus landed on these shores. And you broke treaty after treaty after treaty after treaty, both sides of the aisle. I've been at 8 presidents, and they pay lip service. They pay lip service. The president's going to have a big First American conference, the 5th one. And all they take is tell them again, be quiet, take your blanket and you have a beef and go home. For those talk about the minority, this is the first minority. Yes, I get a little emotional about this because I have 10 American Native grandchildren. I have 2 beautiful American Native children that's given me those damn grandchildren. And I had a wife that was, in fact, one of the first Americans. And I'm proud to be associated with that. We should vote yes on this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Idaho reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my good friend from Alaska on the unconscionable treatment that has been accorded our Native Americans. And I agree that there should be a unique commitment to our Native Americans. But at this point, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the time. Look, we all know what's happening here. If anybody believes that there's a true commitment to fully fund the promises that we have made to America's Native American tribes, you've got to be joking. Look what is not funded in this legislation. It would be really simple to meet the promise that the gentleman spoke so eloquently about, and the way we would do that is to simply bring up a clean bill to reopen the entirety of government. And instead of picking and choosing which promises we will keep to America's Native American tribes, we would keep them all. Instead of skipping the housing programs, skipping the social service programs, and providing a talking point, but not meeting the obligation that this Congress has made to America's Native American tribes. If any community in this country understands broken promises, it's the Native American tribes of this country. In this bill, this legislation simply continues the trail of broken promises.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Reserve my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Idaho.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, a valued member of our subcommittee and probably the largest advocate for Indian issues in Congress, the gentleman, Mr. Cole.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I can agree with parts of what my friends have said and parts I frankly can't agree with. I've worked in a bipartisan manner across the aisle and with the White House on Native American issues ever since I've gotten here, no matter who was on the other side of the aisle or who was in the White House. And I have to tell you, when you question the commitment of our side on Native American affairs, you clearly haven't looked at the record. Because of this chairman, Indian health expenses up 29% in 3 years. Each year for the last 3 years, we have raised above what the administration requested in Native American spending, and that's a fact. And we did it, by the way, in working in a bipartisan manner. I want to give my friend Mr. Moran, my friend Betty McCollum a lot of credit for those achievements, and I want to give our predecessor Norm Dix, who operated in the same way, a lot of credit for that. This is a good faith effort to do exactly what my friends suggest. Make sure that critical programs in Indian country are funded right now. I'll continue to work in a bipartisan manner with my friends on these kinds of and other issues. But to suggest that they are being used as a pawn, no, for the first time they're just not being forgotten about, because that's what tends to happen around here. And that's happened under Democrats and Republicans. So with that, I would urge the adoption and support. I want to thank my friend for being the leader in this House on funding Native American programs, who's done more than anybody in this country to improve the quality and the level of federal services on that. So he ought to be given the credit that he respects. I want to thank my friend Mr. Moran for working with him every step of the way to accomplish those things. I saw them do it when their roles were reversed, and he was the chairman, he was the ranking member. So it's not an effort to divide, it's an effort actually to put something out that has united us in a bipartisan sense, and to make sure that the first Americans aren't the last Americans anybody around here thinks about. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Idaho reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, this releases 0.15% of the federal government, leaving more than 99% of the federal government still closed. So at this point, I'd like to yield for the purposes of a unanimous consent request to our very distinguished Minority Whip, Mr. Hoyer from Maryland.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H. Resolution 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
Under guidelines consistently issued by successive speakers as recorded in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, the Chair is constrained not to entertain the request unless it has been cleared by the bipartisan floor and committee leadership. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield for the purpose of unanimous consent request to Ms. Velasquez from New York.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.R. Resolution 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, the request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to Mr. Green from Texas.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I too ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and to go to conference on a budget so that we can end the Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield for the purpose of unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Hahn.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Resolution 59 to open this government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown that is hurting so many American people.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to House Joint Resolution 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican shutdown now and get the American people back to work.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, this time I yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Speaker, in order to end this Republican shutdown today, to get the people's government working for them again, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up to the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 and open the government without further delay.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hinojosa.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to the House Joint Resolution 59 to open the government and go to the conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
The Chair previously advised that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown and give the American people the relief that they deserve.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance.
I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to a member of the Appropriations Committee from New York, the Honorable Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Speaker.
The Chair would ask that any member seeking recognition remove any communicated badge while making such requests.
You mean this sticker?
Yes.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. We're allowed to bring posters and photographs and other items to the floor. Why not this red, white, and blue sticker?
Badges are not allowed to deliver their remarks to the Chair.
Well, then I'll take it off, but it's with great pain that I do so. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown now.
Previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and to go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown and get our nation back to work.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J.R. Res. 59 instead of leaving for a 3-day weekend, that we open the government and go to conference on a budget and end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, the request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Pelosi has already cleared it. Who's objecting? Who's not clearing it?
Gentleman is not recognized. Gentleman for Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Resolution 59 to open up the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown that's costing the U.S. economy $160 million a day.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from California, a member of the Armed Services Committee, Ms. Susan Davis.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government, go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Speaker, because many families today are not able to pay their mortgage, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on the budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown hurting the children of America.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Terry Sewell.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and to go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown now.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this point I'd like to yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.R. Res. 59 to open government and to go to conference on a budget so we can end this unnecessary Republican government shutdown that hurts veterans and children and the American citizens. Let's open up the government now.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Florida, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I have a parliamentary inquiry, and what I would ask the Speaker to advise this member as to what is the definition of appropriate clearance.
Clearance must be given by leadership and committee staff. Under guidelines consistently issued by successive speakers, as recorded in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, the Chair is constrained not to entertain the request unless it has been cleared by the bipartisan floor and committee leaderships.
Further parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. Do you know, as Speaker, whether or not such an attempt has been made and may be denied with reference to the bipartisan clearance?
As indicated in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, it is not a proper parliamentary inquiry to ask the Chair to indicate which side of the aisle has failed, under the Speaker's guidelines, to clear a unanimous consent request.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. Further parliamentary inquiry. I seek appropriate clearance from you.
Chair has not received appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker,
I still haven't had my unanimous consent request.
I yield time to the gentleman to complete his unanimous consent request.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican shutdown, and that's with or without clearance.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of the unanimous consent request, I yield to the distinguished lady from California, Ms. Bass.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, this time I'd like to yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from California, Mr. Honda.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair has previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the Vice Chair of our Democratic Caucus, Mr. Crowley from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and to go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown. It's time to shut down the shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to Mr. Welch from Vermont.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open up the government and go to conference on a budget so we can end this Republican government shutdown. I yield back.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Shea Porter.
Mr. Speaker.
For the purpose of a unanimous consent.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown and we allow the government to do the people's business again.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of a unanimous consent request, I now yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown now.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the ranking member of our Bank and Finance Committee, Ms. Waters from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this ridiculous Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman with status parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, you have ruled that these unanimous consent requests cannot be entertained because they've not been pre-cleared. It's obvious that Democratic leadership supports these motions, and I'd wonder if it would be in order for the Republicans here and now to pre-clear these unanimous consent requests so we can vote to reopen government.
As indicated in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, it is not a proper parliamentary inquiry to ask the Chair to indicate which side of the aisle has failed under the Speaker's guidelines to clear a unanimous consent request.
Further parliamentary inquiry? Apparently the Chair can't do it is it in order for me to ask the Republicans to pre-clear the unanimous consent request?
The gentleman is free to try to obtain clearance
Well,
on his own.
I would yield to anybody on the Republican side at this time under my parliamentary inquiry to pre-clear.
Gentleman is not recognized to yield. Gentlemen have a unanimous consent request.
I will yield to the gentleman from Virginia for the purpose of a unanimous consent request at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open up the government and to go to conference on the budget so that we can end the Republican shutdown, and let the record reflect that the Republicans have had an opportunity to pre-clear one of these unanimous consent requests.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roybal Allen.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and to go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown today.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government, to go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown and stop holding the economy hostage.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, please, our country is asking, I'm asking unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to House Joint Resolution 59 to open our government and go to conference on a budget so that we will end this Republican government shutdown now and get our government back to work for the American people.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on the budget so that we end this Republican shutdown now.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Republican government shutdown today.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. The House will be in order. If members will take their conversations from the floor. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham.
Mr. Speaker, I join my colleagues today and ask unanimous consent that the House immediately bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Resolution 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end the Republican shutdown immediately.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we can end this Tea Party Republican government shutdown and put people back to work.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up Senate Amendment to House Joint Resolution 59 to open the American people's government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this Republican government shutdown.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentleman from California for the purpose of a unanimous consent request, Mr. Ruiz.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the House bring up the Senate amendment to H.J. Res. 59 to open the government and go to conference on a budget so that we end this reckless and irresponsible government shutdown and do the right thing for the American people.
As the Chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield for the purpose of a unanimous consent request to the Dean of the New York delegation, Mr. Rangel.
Mr. Speaker, may I make a parliamentary inquiry?
Gentleman may state his inquiry.
Under what circumstances could a senior member of this august body protest the shutdown of government at this time?
The gentleman's not making a parliamentary inquiry.
I'm asking from a parliamentary point of view. I don't want to violate the House rules, but as a member of Congress representing 700,000 people, I feel that I have to scream out in protest as to what's happening to the country and my constituents. There has to be some way for me in a parliamentary way, without violating the House rules, to express myself.